The sky above Xanthion bled with the hues of twilight. A peculiar lavender-gold expanse stretched like the sigh of a distant dream, where the faintest whispers of wind caressed the dense, unseen canopies of ancient trees. Their roots burrowed deep into the darkened earth below, but nothing about this world seemed alive in a way that could be easily understood. Life here thrummed in pulses, in silences that smothered noise with the weight of forgotten centuries, a stillness that held something ancient. Captain Riker Cole had known other planets, places of sudden chaos, bustling hubs of human ambition, tranquil worlds where the hum of a ship's engines could lull the soul into reverence. But Xanthion was different. He could feel it even before his boots had hit the ground. It was as if the planet itself were holding its breath, watching the arrival of the humans in a strange and careful dance of fate. The crash had come swiftly, without warning. 1 minute, the exploration vessel was skimming through the outer edges of the atmosphere, a sleek metal bird gliding gracefully into a thick mist of unfamiliar terrain. The next, the vessel was a broken thing, screeching and shuddering, tearing through the violet clouds as if it were a fragile shell cast from the hand of a child. Riker's last memory before the wreck was the sickening rattle of the hull, the shriek of tearing metal, and then silence. Now, in the aftermath, the survivors were scattered, broken, but they were alive. He could hear them. Jake, Tessa, even the quiet hum of something beyond their immediate camp, the sound of something moving. But in the stillness of the alien forest, Riker felt as though something were watching them. He wasn't the only one. The others were jittery, their eyes darting toward every shadow that crept under the canopy. The air felt thick, heavy with secrets. The men, every single one of them, were unarmed. The Zira had seen to that. "Stay sharp," Riker muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The forest was a labyrinth, a living, breathing thing, as though the trees themselves had grown to bear witness to centuries of exile. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the air thick with the suspicion that had settled into the bones of his crew. They had to survive. That was all that mattered now. But there was something else, something Riker couldn't shake. His eyes scanned the surroundings. Too quiet, the kind of quiet that unsettled the nerves. The Zira were out there, watching. He knew it. He had to believe it. But they had not attacked. Not yet. Something glinted through the foliage, catching the dying rays of the setting sun. It was small, metallic, partially obscured by a tangled mess of branches. Riker's heart skipped a beat. The shape was unmistakable. A weapon. But who? His mind raced. Were they not alone? He stepped forward cautiously, motioning for the others to stay low. Each movement was deliberate, cautious. Tessa, her face pale in the dimming light, was beside him in a moment, her breath shallow. "What is it, Riker?" "Stay here," he whispered, his hand brushing her shoulder before he made his way to the strange glint, eyes scanning the trees once more, searching the shadows for any hint of movement. He was close now. Very close. The object was an old-fashioned blade, carved from something organic, a sharp curve to the edge. An alien design. A weapon from a forgotten age, perhaps. Riker knelt, his fingers brushing against the strange material, tracing the runes etched along the surface. The air around him seemed to tremble, as if the planet itself had taken a deep breath, bracing for what was to come. Riker's mind swirled, calculating, but there was no answer, no certainty. It didn't belong to the humans, not to him, not to his crew. Then came the sound, a low thrum, barely audible, as if the very forest had begun to hum with an unspoken warning. Riker froze. His instincts kicked in. He couldn't see them, but they were there. They were always there. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, watching, waiting, predatory and patient. Tessa, her voice now tight with fear, whispered from behind him. "Riker." Then, in the distance, a shrill, haunting scream. Something in Riker's chest clenched. That wasn't human. No, it couldn't be. The sound was jagged, raw, unnatural. But it echoed, long and mournful, like a cry from deep within the bowels of Xanthion itself. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and for a brief moment, the silence stretched thin enough to slice. Then, with a suddenness that made his heart lurch, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping forward with unnatural grace. Her movement was fluid, almost predatory. She was taller than him, draped in dark, weathered armor, her posture regal, unmistakably commanding. A figure that did not belong to this place, not in the same way Riker did. The woman, no, the warrior, watched him closely, her eyes sharp like the blade at her side. "I am Kayla," she spoke, her voice a low, dangerous hum. Her words were not unkind, but the tone carried something Riker could not place. "You've come to the wrong place." The air grew colder. Riker stood frozen, his mind racing. She wasn't alone. He could feel them now, the others, hidden in the trees, surrounding them. The Jira. But why hadn't they attacked yet? He could hear the breathing of his men behind him, sharp and quick. Every breath seemed too loud in the silence that hung between them and the warrior. The unspoken question weighed heavily on him. Who were these women? The blade in Kayla's hand gleamed in the fading light. Something about her presence made the world itself seem sharper, more dangerous, more urgent. But beneath it, there was something else, something deep within her eyes that felt uncertain. There was a mystery here, one that Riker was not yet sure he was ready to face. But the question lingered in his mind, echoing louder than the silence of the forest. Why hadn't they killed him yet? And more unsettling still, what was it they were afraid of? Riker stood motionless, his pulse a drumbeat in his ears. The warrior's presence was suffocating, her form tall and imposing against the dusky backdrop of the alien forest. The sharp curve of her blade glinted in the dying light, a silent promise of violence, but it was her eyes, cold and calculating, that made his skin prickle. They held no malice, but neither did they offer any warmth. Kayla took a step forward, her boots making no sound on the soft earth. Riker felt the air thicken with the weight of her gaze, the unspoken judgment in her eyes like a needle pressing against his chest. He held his breath, forcing his body to remain calm. In this place, tension could snap like a brittle twig. "You are not supposed to be here," she said, her voice smooth, but edged with something heavier. Her words lingered in the air, sharp and brittle, like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Riker's mind raced, searching for the right response, the right approach to de-escalate. If there was one thing he had learned in his years as a captain, it was that survival depended on understanding the enemy, understanding the terrain, and above all understanding the tension that crackled in the space between people, between species, between the living and the unknown. "We're not here to cause trouble," Riker said, keeping his voice even, low. "We're explorers, stranded on this planet. We only need help. We mean no harm." Kayla tilted her head, her expression unreadable. For a long moment she did not speak, her eyes narrowing in what could have been disbelief, or perhaps something deeper. Her fingers tightened slightly around the hilt of her weapon, but she did not raise it. Behind him, Riker heard the faint shuffle of his crew, Jake, Tessa, moving cautiously, staying out of sight but never far from him. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him, just as the warrior felt the weight of his. It was a standoff, but Riker could sense something beneath the surface, a flicker of hesitation in Kayla's movements. "I don't believe you," she murmured at last, her voice laced with an almost imperceptible tremor of doubt. "But you are not the first to come, are you?" The question hit Riker like a physical blow, the impact of it ringing in his ears. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Her meaning was clear. This was not the first time strangers had crashed on Xanthion. This was not the first time humans had trespassed on her world. "Who else has come before us?" Riker asked, his voice low, but his tone sharpened by the need for an answer. Kayla glanced away for a moment, as though the question stirred something in her, something painful. When she spoke again, her voice was colder, more distant. The forest remembers. Riker did not understand, but before he could press further, a sound, distant at first, then growing louder, echoed through the trees. A strange, haunting cry. Not a bird, not an animal. A voice, a woman's voice. Tessa stiffened beside Riker, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Kayla's gaze flicked to Tessa, then back to Riker. Her expression darkened, as if the very air had shifted between them. "You should not have heard that." The words hung in the air like a warning, an omen. Something stirred in the shadows of the trees, shifting like something hidden just out of sight. Riker's heart rate quickened. It wasn't the voice alone that unsettled him. It was the way Kayla reacted, like something ancient had been disturbed. "Stay close," Riker ordered, his voice barely a whisper. He motioned for his crew to move in, positioning them behind him. His thoughts swirled in a mix of suspicion and urgency. The voice was too strange, too out of place to be a mere sound from the planet's wildlife. It was something else. A message. A signal. But from whom? Kayla stepped back, lowering her weapon, but her eyes remained locked on Riker, assessing him with that chillingly detached gaze. "You have trespassed into something that does not belong to you." Riker felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. There was a hidden meaning there, something wrapped in layers of history, in the very fabric of this planet's oppressive silence. Something about the Zira, and what they had lost, and what they had been forced to hide. The air was thick now, charged with the electricity of unsaid things. The cry had stopped, but its echo lingered in Riker's chest, vibrating like a warning bell. Whatever it was, it had been enough to shift Kayla's resolve, enough to make her wary, almost afraid. "Tell me," Riker said, his voice insistent. "What is this place? What is happening here?" Kayla did not respond immediately. Her eyes flitted briefly to the trees, as if seeking something, or someone, before returning to Riker, her expression suddenly grave. "You do not want to know," she said, her voice low, barely a whisper. "It is not safe for you to know." Riker's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle just out of reach, like a tantalizing riddle wrapped in layers of ancient fear. He couldn't shake the feeling that Kayla wasn't speaking about the forest. She wasn't speaking of the planet itself. She was speaking of something else, something that perhaps even the Zira feared. He took a step forward, pressing her. "Then I'll make it safe. I'll make sure we don't cause harm. But I need to know. We need to understand what's here." Kayla's lips pressed into a thin line. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. And then, as if some invisible line had been crossed, the air shifted. The distant sound of footsteps, approaching quickly, too quickly, cut through the stillness. Another figure emerged from the shadows. This one was different. Taller, more regal, her posture commanding. Her eyes met Riker's with an intensity that was almost magnetic. Kayla stiffened, her hand going instinctively to her weapon, but the new figure raised a hand, a single motion, and Kayla hesitated. The stranger stepped into the fading light, and Riker saw her clearly now. She was older than Kayla, though there was an unmistakable strength in her bearing. A woman forged by years of leadership, of survival, and of battle. "I am Lyra," the new figure said, her voice rich and commanding, with the weight of someone who had lived through war and exile. Her gaze swept over Riker and his crew, sharp, calculating. "And you are in no position to be making demands." Riker felt the tension in his chest tighten. Lyra, she was the leader, the one who held the power, and it was clear from the way she regarded him that his survival depended on her decision. The silence thickened once more. "You have questions," Lyra continued, her voice like the rustling of leaves in the wind, as sharp and cutting as a blade. "But you may not like the answers." A chill crept down Riker's spine as he realized he had walked into something far darker, far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. And now, there would be no turning back. The first night on Xanthion was never meant to be this way. Riker had anticipated the dark corners of space, the endless void, perhaps an emergency situation. But not this. Not a world so alien, so unyielding in its silence, in its hostility, and certainly not the women standing before him now, each a force unto herself, each cloaked in a mystery far deeper than any star chart could illuminate. Lyra stood before him, her eyes as unblinking as the twin moons above. There was something unearthly in her gaze, something ancient and fierce, as if her very presence was a rebellion against the laws of nature. She spoke again, and the words settled heavily between them, like stones thrown into the water, each one rippling outward in all directions. "You have come at a time that is neither fortunate nor wise," Lyra said, her voice unwavering, like the distant rumble of thunder. "The forest has stirred. The land has shifted, and the old stories have begun to speak." Riker's mind raced to keep up, to make sense of the words, but they were slipping through his fingers like sand. The tension in the air was thick, heavy with the promise of something imminent, something dangerous. He swallowed hard, forcing his thoughts into order. "What do you mean, the old stories?" His voice was calm, measured, but his heart was pounding in his chest. He knew this moment was pivotal. He knew the next words from her lips would change everything. Lyra's lips twitched, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk, though it did not reach her eyes. "The stories of our ancestors, the stories of men and women, of the past that haunts us still. You do not know the truth of this place. Not yet." Her words cut into him, sharp and jagged. He had known, deep down, that the history of this planet was more than just the barren wilderness around them, more than the threats lurking in the shadows. But he hadn't expected this. This cryptic air of dread that hung between the Zira and himself, this sense that there were things hidden here, buried beneath the surface, just waiting to be unearthed. "We're not here to intrude," Riker said, his voice steady despite the unease growing in his gut. "We're stranded. Our ship's wreckage is in pieces. We need help. We need resources. And we need to know what's out there, what's happening on this planet." Lyra's eyes flickered, but she did not look away. Instead, she stepped closer, her movements like those of a predator assessing her prey. "You think you can simply ask for help?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. "What makes you so certain we would give it?" A question Riker had anticipated, but one whose answer was less clear now. His crew had followed him here, trusting him to lead them to safety. But now, standing before Lyra and Kyla, surrounded by these women who seemed to be wrapped in a world of their own, he wasn't so sure that trust was going to be enough. "Because you need us," Riker said, a hint of defiance creeping into his voice. "Whatever this land is, whatever these old stories are, you need us. And we need you." The silence that followed was profound. Even the sounds of the forest seemed to fall away, as though the world itself was holding its breath. For a moment, no one moved. Not Kyla, not Lyra, and not even Riker's crew who stood in the shadows behind him. It was as though something deeper had shifted in the air, something that went beyond survival, beyond the crashing of ships and the battle for resources. It was a question of belief, of trust, of survival itself, and Riker felt it keenly. And then, unexpectedly, Lyra spoke again. But her voice was different, softer, almost hesitant. "You should not have come here, Captain Cole," she said, her gaze flicking toward Kayla, who remained unmoving. "You have awakened something that we cannot control." Riker stiffened. "What are you talking about? What's here? What is this place?" Lyra turned, her cloak brushing against the ground, her face momentarily hidden in shadow. When she spoke again, her words were heavy, weighed down by the gravity of some long-held truth. "You are not the first to land here," she said, her voice low, almost regretful. "Long ago we were visited by others, men who came in ships of fire, and they too sought our help. They too believed they could survive. But they never left." Riker's heart skipped a beat. The implication of her words was clear. The history of Xanthion was one of far darker shades than he had imagined. The women before him, the Zira, were not simply survivors of a hostile world. They were survivors of something far worse. You mean the men who came before us? They didn't leave?" Riker's voice faltered, the horror of the realization sinking in. Lyra nodded once, slowly. "They did not leave. And neither will you." A chill ran through Riker's spine as her words hit him like a physical blow. For the first time since his crew had crash-landed, the enormity of their situation settled into the pit of his stomach. There was something darker at play here, something far beyond their initial understanding, and he had just unknowingly walked straight into it. But before he could respond, before he could process what Lyra had just said, a low growl rumbled from the forest beyond. It was a deep, guttural sound, one that resonated with the very bones of the ground beneath them. Riker's heart leapt into his throat. "Get down!" he shouted, his voice sharp, commanding. At once, his crew moved into action, instinctively ducking behind the cover of nearby trees. Kayla, though, was already in motion, moving with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to battle, her weapon raised, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the threat. Lyra, too, seemed unbothered by the sudden noise. Her expression was unreadable as she calmly surveyed the area. "It has come," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. Riker's pulse quickened as a shape shifted in the darkness of the trees, huge, hulking, with eyes that glowed like embers in the night. The creature emerged, its low growl reverberating through the air, the forest shaking with its power. It was unlike anything Riker had ever seen before, an amalgamation of fury and instinct, a predator born of this strange world. The Zira reacted as if they had expected it. Lyra moved to the front, Kayla close behind, her weapon ready. The creature's eyes locked onto them, and for a fleeting moment, Riker wondered if they were all about to become prey. But then Lyra raised her hand, a single motion that stopped the world dead in its tracks. The creature paused, its massive chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. And in that moment, Riker understood. This was no mere animal. This was a creature of the planet, something tied to the Zira, something that had been awakened by their arrival, a truth long buried, now brought to light. Lyra turned to Riker, her eyes narrowing. "This is what you have disturbed," she said, her voice cold, "and it will not stop until it has claimed what is its own." Riker felt the weight of her words settle over him like an iron shackle. They were no longer just stranded on a hostile planet. They were part of something far older, far more dangerous. And now, there was no turning back. The creature loomed before them, its eyes a fiery red that seemed to pierce the darkness with an unearthly intensity. Riker could hear the harsh beat of his own heart in his ears, but in the stillness of the night, the creature's growls were louder, more terrifying. It was the kind of thing one might imagine in nightmares, vicious, primal, with a sense of intelligence lurking behind its gaze, as though it had seen centuries unfold in the shadows of the Xanthion forest. Lyra's hand remained raised, her eyes unwavering as she studied the creature before her. Kayla, poised and tense, her weapon drawn, seemed ready to strike, yet there was a pause in her movements as she gauged the creature's intent. The forest, alive with the sounds of distant creatures, had fallen eerily silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Riker's mind raced. There was something profoundly wrong with all of this. The mystery that had started with the crash of their ship, with the strange hostility of the Zira, now expanded into something that transcended his crew's immediate survival. This wasn't just about landing on an uncharted world. This wasn't just about resources and escape. This was about something far deeper, darker, something connected to the very heart of Xanthion itself. "What is this thing?" Riker asked, his voice barely above a whisper, though the intensity of his gaze never wavered from the creature. Lyra's lips barely moved as she spoke, but her voice was sharp and unyielding. "The Watcher," she said simply, "the Protector, and the Destroyer." Riker's gut clenched at the word. It echoed through him, deeper than any understanding of their current plight. It sounded like something they were not meant to face, something far older than any of them. "What do you mean, protector and destroyer?" Tessa's voice came from behind him, a mix of curiosity and fear threading through her words. Lyra turned her head, just enough for Tessa to see the harsh set of her features. "You will learn in time. But now—" She didn't finish the sentence. The Watcher took a single step forward, its massive paws crunching through the thick undergrowth. The ground shook beneath it, and Riker felt it then, an undeniable pulse, something deep in the earth, stirring beneath the roots of the trees. It was as if the creature's movement had awakened the very land itself. "Don't engage," Kayla muttered, her hand tightening on her weapon. "It's not a fight we can win." Before Riker could respond, the creature lowered its head, its massive maw opening wide. The air around them seemed to bend, as though the forest itself recoiled in anticipation. But Lyra's expression didn't shift. She stepped forward, her stance unwavering, her gaze locked onto the Watcher. "Stand back," she commanded, her voice low but firm. For a moment, Riker thought she was about to attack, or worse, that they were all going to become the creature's next meal. But instead, Lyra spoke softly, her words alien to Riker's ears, an incantation of sorts, perhaps a prayer or a command. The Watcher's growl softened, its massive form halting as it tilted its head toward her. "There is power here," Riker said, more to himself than to anyone else, a realization seeping through him like cold water. "A power that connects this forest, the land, the creatures, and you." Lyra's sharp gaze flickered toward him. "You see it now, the bond, the deep roots of this world. You have disturbed them, Captain Cole." She turned back to the Watcher, and for a long moment, the creature and the woman shared some unspoken understanding, a silent communication that seemed to stretch through time itself. Finally, with a low rumble, the Watcher stepped aside, retreating back into the shadows of the trees. "Go," Lyra ordered, her tone softer now, as if the threat had been momentarily soothed, "before it changes its mind." Riker didn't need to be told twice. He motioned for his crew to follow, and they moved swiftly, keeping their eyes on the shifting shadows as they made their way back to the safety of the Zira encampment. Behind them, the Watcher's presence seemed to hang in the air, like a lingering specter, its watchful eyes still tracking their every move. The tension didn't ease as they reached the clearing, though. As soon as they were inside the compound, Riker found himself faced with Lyra again, this time her expression unreadable. "What was that thing?" Tessa asked, her voice strained from the adrenaline. Lyra didn't answer immediately, her gaze flicking over to where the Watcher had vanished into the depths of the forest. "That," she said after a long pause, "was only the beginning." Xantheon is a world that remembers, and it does not forget. Kayla, who had remained silent since the encounter, finally spoke, her voice laced with disbelief. "The Watcher has never shown itself like that before. What are you not telling us, Lyra? What is really going on here?" Lyra's eyes narrowed, and for the briefest of moments, Riker saw something deep and unsettling in her gaze. A flicker of fear? No, not fear. It was something else, something ancient, something personal. "You need to understand," Lyra said slowly, her words heavy, pregnant with unspoken history. "This world has seen more than its share of outsiders, more than you could ever know. It has borne witness to centuries of bloodshed, of betrayal, and of a debt that must be paid." Riker's brow furrowed. The words struck him like a blow, and something deep in him shifted, like a door creaking open. He was beginning to understand that the conflict he'd walked into wasn't just between his crew and the Zira. It wasn't just a matter of survival. This was something much, much older. "I don't understand," he admitted, his voice quiet but resolute. "What debt? What betrayal?" For a long moment, Lyra said nothing. Then she motioned to Kayla, who stepped forward, holding something in her hand, a stone, rough and jagged, with strange markings carved into its surface. Riker couldn't make sense of the symbols, but there was something undeniably familiar about them, something that stirred a memory he couldn't quite place. This, Lyra said, her voice cold, was left here. By them. By who? Riker pressed, his impatience starting to show. Lyra's gaze turned hard. By the men who came before you, the ones who never left. The stone and the implications of Lyra's words hit Riker with a force that left him reeling. He had thought they were stranded, lost in the wilderness of an alien world. But now the past was rising before him, a storm of secrets and betrayals, of old wounds that hadn't healed, and perhaps never would. The debt had been paid, and now they were all part of it. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Riker knew one thing for certain. Nothing on Xantheon was ever truly forgotten. The sky above Xantheon had shifted. Gone was the thick, unyielding darkness that had clung to the planet's dense atmosphere. Now a strange and fractured light broke through the trees in pale streaks, illuminating the ancient ruins of the Jira's home. Their village, once hidden in shadow, now seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of a forgotten time, as though it had always known this moment would come. Riker stood at the edge of the clearing, gazing out over the endless stretch of forest, where the remnants of his crew's survival and the haunting presence of the Watcher had left a mark on his soul. The events of the past days had woven a complex web, one that pulled at the fabric of their existence and exposed the truth about not just Xantheon, but about their place within it. Lyra stood beside him, her posture no longer that of a hardened leader, but of someone who had witnessed too much of the world's ancient weight. They had spoken little after the Watcher had shown itself, the silence between them filled with the unspoken understanding that things would never be the same. Not for him, not for her, and not for the world that both their peoples had claimed. "The debt is paid," she said softly, her words carrying the weight of years of silence, of unspoken truths. Riker turned toward her, eyes searching for some final understanding in the depths of her fierce yet sorrow-filled gaze. "And what happens now?" Lyra's lips parted, but no words came at first. It was as if she was still calculating the cost of what they had done, the steps they had taken, and the consequences they had left behind. The tribe, the Xira, had been fractured, but in the breaking, it had also begun to heal. There would be no turning back from the decisions they had made, and in some ways, Riker knew that they were no longer strangers, no longer enemies. They had shared the very core of this planet's ancient power, and in doing so, they had become linked. "We rebuild," she said finally, the weight of her voice both resolute and heavy. "Not just our society, not just our people, but the bond between us all." The fire in Riker's chest flickered, somewhere between relief and regret. The choice he had made, the path that had led him from the wreckage of his ship to the heart of this alien world, had come with costs. Not all debts could be settled in full. Not all sacrifices could be measured. Yet, in the silence that stretched between him and Lyra, there was an undeniable understanding that they had shared something rare, something crucial. In the ruins of the Xira's village, the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The Watcher had not been the mindless beast they had once feared, nor had it been a protector in the traditional sense. It had been a guardian, yes, but it was also something else, a witness, a keeper of the past, the one who had borne witness to the first betrayal and would stand guard over the second. Its presence had not been about wrath, it had been about balance. The stone Lyra had shown them, the one marked with the ancient symbols, was more than a relic. It was the key to understanding the pact, the treaty between the old world and the new. The men who had come before had left their mark, not as conquerors, but as fools, and the Watcher had been there to witness their actions, waiting for the day when the debt would need to be repaid. "I don't know if we can rebuild it all," Riker confessed, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "But I know that we can try." Lyra nodded, her expression softening for a moment. "There are more stories than you could ever know, Captain Cole. more lives intertwined than you could imagine. We are the keepers of a history that is both our burden and our salvation, and now it is yours as much as it is ours. The last of the survivors, the crew of the crashed vessel, gathered around the fire as the twilight deepened. Tessa, Kayla, and Jake, their faces streaked with the marks of their journey, watched in silence. They had endured trials of survival, of betrayal, of confrontation, but none had been as deep as the rift they had crossed between worlds, between peoples. Kayla caught Riker's eye, a glimmer of something like understanding in her steely gaze. The walls between them, the walls that had been built on distrust, had crumbled. They no longer stood as enemies, but as something far more powerful, allies. It was Jake who finally broke the silence, his voice raspy from the days of strain and struggle. So, what now? We leave? Do we just walk away from this place? Lyra looked to him, her gaze sharper now, still holding the fire of her people's pride and anger. Leave? She almost scoffed, but there was a trace of a smile in her voice. The Watcher will not allow that. Not yet. There are still tests to come. Riker's chest tightened. The Watcher, the unyielding presence that had followed them since the beginning. He could feel it now, as surely as if it were a pulse beneath his feet. There would be no easy path forward, no simple return to what they had been. Whatever trials were left, they would face them together. And the truth of it, the bitter, hard truth, was that the only way out was through. So, we're stuck here for a while? Tessa asked, a wry smile on her lips, though the exhaustion in her eyes betrayed her fatigue. For now, Lyra said, her tone light but not without a certain weight. But the forest will guide you. The Watcher will show you the way. And in time, perhaps we will all find peace. The fire crackled in the quiet air, casting flickering shadows across the faces of those gathered around it. There was no immediate answer, no sudden revelation that would change everything. Only the slow, painful resolution of what had come before, the fractured bonds of men and women, of people and creatures, and the uncertain promise of what might come next. Riker took one last look at the faces of those who had survived, those who had endured the impossible, and he knew in his heart that the journey wasn't over. It could never be. Not here. Not on Xanthion. The past had left its mark on them all, and only by facing the mysteries of this alien world would they ever find the closure they sought. The stars above began to emerge, scattered across the velvet sky. They were endless, infinite, yet distant, and in that vastness, Riker could feel something shift, a sense of connection, of knowing. The Watcher was still there, hidden somewhere in the depths of the forest, watching, waiting, but no longer a threat. For the first time since the crash, Riker Cole felt a sliver of hope. It wasn't the hope of escape, nor the hope of easy answers. It was the hope of understanding, and that in this strange, alien place was enough. The fire crackled once more, its light flickering out into the unknown, and Riker closed his eyes, knowing that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The winds on Charon's Reach howled like a mournful dirge, carrying with them the bitter sting of ash and frost. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the sprawl of human habitation and the endless expanse of ice fields, the fractured remains of an alien monument stood defiant against time. It was said the Cerithians had built it long before humanity ever set foot on this world. But now it was a ruin, much like the uneasy truce that had brought Captain Gabriel Blackwood here. He tightened his coat against the biting cold and stepped off the transport shuttle, his boots sinking into the soft black snow. The base loomed ahead, a cluster of sharp, angular structures illuminated by a lattice of cold blue lights. The sharpness of the architecture was distinctly human, pragmatic, unyielding. It stood in stark contrast to the whispers of organic curves and faint, pulsing light that defined what little was known of Cerithian design. He was barely through the decontamination chamber when Commander Duran's voice buzzed over his comm implant, sharp and efficient as ever. "Blackwood, report to Hangar 6, now." No explanation, no room for discussion. Gabe clenched his jaw, fighting the flicker of irritation that had become all too familiar since his reassignment to this backwater outpost. He had spent years on the front lines, where orders were barked over the thunder of artillery, where lives were lost in the blink of an eye. Now the war had paused, though no one dared to call it peace, and he was a soldier with no battlefield, stationed on a frozen rock, light years from Earth. Hangar 6 was a cavernous void, its metallic walls lined with rows of transport crafts and idle personnel. Gabe spotted Commander Durand immediately, her crisp uniform and tightly coiled braid as rigid as the frown etched on her face. But his attention was quickly drawn to the figure standing at her side. The woman, no, the Cerithian, was unlike anything he had seen before. She stood impossibly still, her hands clasped before her gaze fixed on some indeterminate point in the distance. Her skin was a soft, iridescent shade of violet, shimmering faintly under the hangar lights. And her eyes. Gabe had seen alien eyes before, but hers were arresting, deep pools of silver, swirling faintly, as if containing the remnants of a dying star. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal, framed by hair that flowed like liquid obsidian. "This is Aylin," Durand said brusquely, her voice cutting through the silence. "She's your assignment." Gabe frowned, his mind struggling to process the implications. "My assignment?" Durand's lips pressed into a thin line. Diplomatic gesture. "You've been chosen to host her during her stay. She'll be under your supervision." Aylin inclined her head slightly, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. When she spoke, her voice was soft and melodic, but there was a formality to it that set his nerves on edge. "You can ask anything of me, Captain Blackwood," she said. The words hung in the air, unnatural and practiced. Gabe's frown deepened. "And if I refuse?" he asked, his tone sharper than intended. Durand's expression hardened. "You won't. This comes straight from the High Command." Gabe stared at Aylin, searching for any sign of emotion behind her carefully constructed mask. She remained unreadable, her gaze steady but distant, as if she were both present and somewhere else entirely. Durand's voice dropped, her next words meant for him alone. "This isn't a request, Blackwood. It's politics. You don't have to like it, but you will comply." The commander didn't wait for his response. She spun on her heel and strode out of the hangar, leaving Gabe alone with his new assignment. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hangar, once filled with the ambient hum of machinery and low murmurs of conversation, now seemed oppressively quiet. "Follow me," Gabe said finally, his voice clipped. Aylin obeyed without a word. The walk to his quarters was tense, their footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. Gabe could feel the weight of her presence behind him, unnervingly silent and precise. The few soldiers they passed stared openly, their curiosity poorly disguised. He could hear their murmurs as they walked by, speculation, unease, and something darker, resentment. When they reached his quarters, Gabe stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. The room was sparsely furnished, with a cot, a metal desk cluttered with datapads, and a single chair. Aylin stepped inside and stood near the center of the room, her posture as composed as ever. She looked out of place against the stark utilitarian backdrop, like a rare and fragile artifact displayed in a barren museum. Gabe shut the door behind them and crossed his arms. "So what's your angle?" Aylin tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged. "I do not understand the question." "You're here to serve me, is that it?" His tone dripped with skepticism. "Seems like a strange way to keep the peace." Her gaze met his, calm and unwavering. "I am here to ensure harmony between our people." "By being assigned to me like a piece of equipment?" Gabe scoffed. Aylin's silence was answer enough. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face, something small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Doubt, perhaps, or something akin to it. "Do you distrust me, Captain?" she asked softly. "I distrust everyone," he replied without hesitation. She nodded as if that answer were perfectly acceptable, even expected. "Then perhaps we are not so different." The words caught him off guard, and for a moment he had no response. Aylin turned away, her gaze drifting to the single window in the room. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind screaming against the base's reinforced walls. Gabe watched her carefully, his instincts honed from years on the battlefield, screaming that there was more to her than she let on. Her poise, her careful choice of words, the way she seemed to inhabit the space without truly being part of it, it all felt calculated. And yet, there was something disarming about her presence, something he couldn't quite place. The mystery of her was a weight that settled heavily in the room, as palpable as the storm outside. "Rest if you need to," he said finally, his voice gruff. "But don't expect me to make this easy." Aylin turned back to him, her silver eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "I do not expect anything, Captain. Only that you ask of me what you will." With that, she sank gracefully to the floor, folding her legs beneath her in a meditative pose. Gabe watched her for a long moment before turning away, unease prickling at the back of his neck. There was something deeply unsettling about her composure, something that made him wonder, not for the first time, what exactly she had been sent here to do. The base was silent that night, save for the whisper of the wind that battered against the reinforced walls. Gabe sat at his desk, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. His fingers moved over the surface of a datapad, scrolling through mission reports and intelligence briefings, but his mind was elsewhere. Aylin had remained perfectly still since their brief exchange hours ago, her posture like a statue, her eyes never wavering from the window. He had expected more of a reaction, something, anything to break the coldness that surrounded her. But she had said little beyond those strange, unsettling words. "I do not expect anything, Captain, only that you ask of me what you will." What did that mean? He had tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut, the sensation that something wasn't right, but the truth was, he could feel her presence even in the stillness. The air seemed denser when she was near, as if her very being bent the atmosphere around her. It wasn't just her beauty. It wasn't just her alien grace. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite place, something that whispered of things unsaid, things that should remain unsaid. Gabe stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor, and moved to the window. The storm outside had intensified, snow whipping in violent gusts. The view was a blur of white and gray, the world outside buried beneath the weight of the elements. His reflection stared back at him, tired eyes, graying hair, and a face marked by the years of war. He could hardly recognize himself anymore. With a deep sigh, he turned away from the glass. His gaze fell on Aylin. She hadn't moved. For a fleeting moment, he almost wished she would speak, break the silence, ease the tension. But what would she say? Did she know he was watching her? Did she care? The thought unsettled him more than it should have. "Why are you here, Aylin?" Gabe asked, his voice low but firm. For a moment, there was no response. Then, without shifting her gaze from the window, she spoke, her voice distant, as though the words were not meant for him. "To heal the rift between our peoples," she replied, almost as if reciting a lesson. Gabe's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Heal?" Aylin's eyes shifted slightly, though her body remained unmoving. "To mend what has been broken, to restore balance." Gabe shook his head, the skepticism rising in him like bile. Balance? Between them and us? Between war and peace? He had seen enough of that in his life to know that the truth was never as simple as it appeared. The Cerithians were not here to heal. They were here for something else. He didn't know what, but he could feel it in his bones. "I don't trust you," he muttered, more to himself than to her. The room was still, save for the faint hum of the ventilation system. But Aylin's voice, when it came, was like a whisper carried on the wind, her words cutting through the silence with an eerie calm. "I do not need your trust, Captain." Gabe turned to her sharply, his irritation flaring. "Then what do you need?" Aylin didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him with those impossibly silver eyes, her expression unreadable, her features soft yet sharp at the same time. There was something about her, something so unknowable that it made him want to dig deeper, to unravel whatever secrets she was hiding. But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, he pushed it away. He couldn't afford distractions. Not here. Not now. "Rest," he said abruptly, his voice a little harsher than intended. "We'll talk more tomorrow. I'll assign you to duties then." Aylin nodded, though her gaze lingered on him just a moment longer than necessary. The night passed uneventfully, but Gabe's sleep was fitful. Dreams, dark and twisted, lurked at the edges of his consciousness. Memories of battles fought and comrades lost, the distant echoes of screams that no one else seemed to hear. He awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering in his chest. There was something in the air. He had been right to distrust Aylin. There was no question about it now. Her presence, her silence, her strange, emotionless gaze. Everything about her felt like a well-crafted performance. She wasn't here to heal anything. She was here for a reason, and that reason had little to do with peace. He stood and paced the length of the room, trying to shake off the lingering unease. His eyes darted to the datapad on his desk, where a new message had appeared in the middle of the night, marked as urgent. Gabe swiped it open. The message was from an encrypted source, someone inside the Cerithian faction. The text was brief but unsettling. "Do not trust her. She is not what she seems. She is a weapon, a tool of manipulation. Watch her closely." Gabe's pulse quickened. A weapon? He had suspected as much, but the confirmation hit him like a punch to the gut. Aylin was here for something else entirely, and whatever it was far more dangerous than anything he had anticipated. He glanced toward the window, the storm outside still raging, as if nature itself were trying to warn him. His thoughts churned in a swirl of confusion and suspicion, but there was one thing that stood clear in his mind. He couldn't let her play him. But how to stop her? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Without waiting for a response, Aylin entered, her movements as fluid and deliberate as ever. She met his gaze with that same unsettling calm, her eyes betraying nothing. "Captain," she said softly, "I was informed that there would be duties for me today." The chill in her voice was different now, slightly more insistent, more direct. There was something in the air between them, something that crackled with unspoken tension. Gabe's heart skipped a beat. "Not yet," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts raging inside. "I need some time to assess things." Aylin didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, her eyes searching as though weighing something he couldn't quite understand. "I'll be here when you're ready, Captain," she said, her voice soft, but with an undertone of something more, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. As she turned to leave, Gabe's eyes followed her every move. Her presence in the room, the way she moved with such purpose, it all felt wrong, like a carefully placed puzzle piece he couldn't quite make fit. When the door clicked shut behind her, the room fell back into silence. But the weight of her absence only served to heighten the tension. Something was coming, something that would force him to make a choice that could change everything. Gabe had never been one to ignore his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being screamed at him to stay alert, to stay sharp. The message from the Cerithian insider echoed in his mind, its stark warning carving through the layers of doubt he had been trying to ignore. "Do not trust her. She is not what she seems. She is a weapon, a tool of manipulation. Watch her closely." The problem was, Gabe didn't know how to watch her without revealing his suspicion. Aylin was not just a diplomat. She was something far more dangerous, and he had yet to figure out exactly what role she played in the larger, shadowed game between their peoples. He paced the small room again, the walls closing in as his thoughts twisted into knots. His eyes kept darting toward the window, where the storm outside had taken on a relentless fury. It was as though the very weather was conspiring to isolate them, to force him into a decision he wasn't ready to make. A knock at the door broke his concentration. His breath caught in his throat for a split second. His instincts were on high alert again, but he couldn't ignore the calm that filled his chest at the same time. "Come in," he called, his voice neutral. The door slid open, and Aylin stepped inside, her movements as fluid and poised as ever. But today, there was something different in the air, a tension that lingered like the calm before a storm. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was something more than just the serene, emotionless stare. There was an undercurrent, something that spoke to a depth he hadn't seen before. "I've been instructed to report for duty," she said softly, her voice laced with something that made his stomach tighten. Something was wrong. Gabe's eyes narrowed as he studied her, the subtle shifts in her demeanor not lost on him. She wasn't as detached as she had been the night before. There was a change in the way she moved, in the way her gaze lingered on him. It was deliberate, almost too deliberate. "Duty?" Gabe asked, his tone measured. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Aylin stepped closer to him, her eyes never leaving his, and Gabe felt the air in the room grow thick with tension. There was an unsettling calm in her presence, a silence that threatened to suffocate him. "I am yours to command, Captain Blackwood," she said, her voice soft and smooth. But there was a certain weight to the words, an undeniable finality in them. Gabe's heart skipped a beat, but he pushed the reaction down. His mind raced. "Yours to command?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Was this the moment? Was this where the power dynamic between them would settle? "I don't need you to be anything but a piece of the puzzle," he replied gruffly, trying to keep his composure. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. He needed her to be more than that. She had to be more than that, or else the stakes in this twisted game of diplomacy would be lost. Aylin tilted her head slightly, her eyes widening just a fraction. "You misunderstand me, Captain." Her voice softened, but there was a sharpness beneath it now, an edge that hadn't been there before. "I am not merely a piece of this puzzle. I am the key." Gabe's pulse quickened. That was not what he had expected her to say. A key? Before he could respond, a loud, shuddering blast rang through the walls of the base. The ground trembled beneath his feet, a violent tremor that sent dust falling from the ceiling. The overhead lights flickered before stabilizing, leaving the room in an eerie, dim light. The base was under attack. Gabe's heart raced, adrenaline flooding his veins as he bolted to the door, instinctively reaching for the sidearm holstered at his waist. "What the hell was that?" he muttered to himself. But when he turned back to Aylin, she was no longer standing where she had been. He looked around the room, but she was gone. His fingers tightened around the grip of his weapon. There was no time to waste. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Gabe rushed out into the hallway, only to find the corridor eerily empty. The usual bustle of soldiers and staff was replaced with an unsettling silence. The blast had sent a ripple of panic through the base, and every instinct he had screamed that this was no ordinary attack. This was a message, a signal from someone who knew exactly how to strike when they had the upper hand. His comm device crackled to life. It was Duran's voice, sharp and commanding, her tone unmistakable even through the static. "Blackwood, report to the command center immediately. We've got a situation." He didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel and sprinted toward the command center, his mind racing. The blast had come from the direction of the eastern perimeter. The Cerithians had no reason to attack the base. They were supposed to be in a truce, weren't they? But this felt different. This felt planned. When Gabe reached the command center, Durand was waiting for him. Her face was pale, but her expression was hard, unwavering. Around her, the room buzzed with a flurry of activity, soldiers and officers working frantically at their consoles. "What the hell is going on?" Gabe demanded, breathless from his sprint. Durand shot him a look, her eyes narrowing. "We've been hit, on the outer perimeter. A blast, followed by a series of comm signals we can't decrypt. It's an ambush, Blackwood. He felt the words hit him like a slap. Ambush? His gut twisted. He had been trained for moments like this, but something about this attack felt off. The lack of clarity in the intel, the strange silence in the halls, it all pointed to something more. Something deliberate. And Aylin? Gabe asked, unable to suppress the edge in his voice. Duran's gaze flickered toward the side of the room, where several Cerethian diplomats were standing. They were speaking in hushed tones, too quiet for Gabe to hear. "She's not here," Duran said flatly, as if that was supposed to reassure him. But it didn't. It only added more weight to the growing sense of unease that settled like lead in his chest. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the realization hit him with full force. Aylin had known. She had known about the attack. She had left just before it happened, disappearing with a chilling sense of purpose. And now, with the base under siege, Gabe was left with a choice. Trust the Cerethians, or trust his instincts. But in the end he realized there was no choice at all. Aylin had been the key to the game all along. But which side was she really playing for? The walls of the command center seemed to pulse with a dull, anxious hum, a rhythm that matched the beating of Gabe's heart. The storm outside had not let up, but it felt as though something much darker had settled in with it. The air inside the room was thick with tension, the kind that clung to the skin like oil, making every breath feel heavier than the last. Gabe stood rigid, his mind torn between the mission at hand and the unsettling absence of Aylin. Where had she gone? Why had she disappeared at the exact moment the attack came? His gut told him the two were connected, and if that was true, if she was behind it, then everything he thought he knew about her was wrong. Durand was barking orders, her voice cutting through the noise of the room, but Gabe couldn't focus on her. His eyes were scanning the dimly lit screens, watching the feed of the eastern perimeter. The outer walls had sustained heavy damage, but there was nothing there now. No signs of the attackers, no clues to their identity. It was as if the blast had come from nowhere, and yet he knew that couldn't be true. "How much time do we have?" Gabe asked, his voice grim. Durand turned sharply, her gaze sharp as steel. "We have enough to defend the base, but not enough to figure out what the hell is going on. They're not human, those blast signatures. No human weapon could do that." Gabe felt a chill seep into his bones. The Cerethians. He'd seen their power firsthand during the war, their advanced technology and ruthless tactics. But this was different. This was a message. A warning from someone who knew how to manipulate the delicate balance they had barely managed to achieve. "Has Aylin been located?" Gabe asked again, his voice a little more urgent now. Durand hesitated, her gaze shifting to the communications officer who had been working frantically at his console. There was something in her expression, something he couldn't quite place, that unsettled him even further. "Not yet," she said, her voice clipped. "But I'm sure she's just hiding, waiting for orders. She'll be in touch when she's ready." "Ready for what?" Gabe snapped, unable to control his frustration any longer. She knew about this attack, Durand. She left just before it happened. You think that's just a coincidence? Durand's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing at first. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with every passing second. She finally spoke, her voice low and tight. "Do you really think she's capable of something like this? That she would betray us after everything we've worked for?" Gabe didn't respond. He couldn't. The thought of Aylin, her calm, unwavering presence, betraying him seemed impossible. And yet, the pieces were falling into place. She had been so poised, so obedient, always offering herself as though she had no agency. But now, in the quiet, it felt as though he had been looking at the wrong version of her all along. Suddenly, the comm systems crackled to life, drawing Gabe's attention. Durand's face tightened as she motioned for the officer to patch the transmission through. "Aylin." Durand's voice was a command in itself. The screen flickered, and then there she was, standing in a shadowed corridor. Her face was calm, unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that Gabe had never seen before, a flicker of something darker. It was as though she was standing on the edge of some terrible precipice, just waiting to leap into the unknown. "Aylin." Gabe's voice was hoarse, his heart pounding in his chest. "Where the hell are you? We need you here." "I know," she said softly, her voice an eerie calmness that sent a shiver through him. "But I cannot come back, Gabe, not yet." The words hit him like a blow, his chest tightening with the weight of them. "What do you mean, not yet?" he demanded. "What's going on? What the hell did you do?" Aylin's expression shifted just slightly, a faint flicker of something dangerous crossing her face before it was gone. She took a slow breath, as though gathering herself, before she spoke again. "I've been given a choice," she said, her tone shifting as though she were speaking through a veil, far away. "The attack was only the beginning. You need to understand something. You're all caught in something much larger than you realize." Gabe's stomach dropped. A choice? What did she mean? "What the hell does that mean?" he asked, his voice rising despite himself. "Why didn't you tell me? Why all the secrecy?" "I couldn't," Aylin replied, her voice unwavering. "Because you would have stopped me. You're a soldier, Gabe. You're bound by duty. But I am not bound by the same chains." The words hung in the air, thick with an ominous weight. Gabe felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath him. She had never been who he thought she was. The quiet, docile creature who had arrived with the peace treaty, the one he had tried to protect, was now someone else entirely. "What choice?" Gabe demanded again, desperation edging his words. "What's happening? Tell me, Aylin." She shook her head, her long hair flowing around her shoulders like an unspoken promise. "I cannot explain it all now. You wouldn't understand. But you need to know this war was never about us. It's about the ones pulling the strings, the ones who never wanted peace." Gabe's blood ran cold as the meaning of her words settled over him like a shroud. The ones pulling the strings. She was talking about someone else, someone even more dangerous than the Cerithians or humans. "Who?" he whispered. "Who is behind this?" Aylin looked down for a moment, as if struggling with a decision, before meeting his gaze once more. "The Syndicate. They are the true force behind the conflict. They've been using both our people as pawns in a game we never even knew was being played." The word hit him like a punch to the gut. The Syndicate. Everyone had heard the rumors, but no one knew for sure. They were the shadows behind every major conflict, the hidden puppet masters who thrived on war, on chaos. No one had dared speak their name for fear of retaliation. But now, it was all becoming clear. "You've been working for them?" Gabe's voice was hoarse, his chest constricting as the weight of the betrayal settled in. Aylin's eyes softened, though there was a sadness in them that cut through him like a blade. "I have no choice, Gabe. I never did." He felt his legs weaken, as though the ground beneath him had given way entirely. The woman he had trusted, who he had come to rely on, was caught in a web of manipulation and lies, just like him. He turned to Durand, his heart racing. "What the hell are we supposed to do now?" Durand's voice was quiet, but it carried an iron edge. "We prepare. We fight. The Syndicate may think they're untouchable, but they've underestimated us before. We're not backing down." Gabe nodded, but the weight of Aylin's words gnawed at him. This was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a battle for something much deeper, something that neither side had fully understood. And now, with Aylin's revelation hanging in the air, Gabe knew that the game had changed forever. There was no going back. The base was quiet, far quieter than it had any right to be. The storm outside had finally dissipated, leaving the landscape shrouded in a thick, unnatural fog. It clung to the jagged rocks and scarred earth like a shroud, muffling the distant sounds of gunfire and the echo of battle. Inside the command center, however, there was a suffocating stillness. Gabe stood in front of the main console, staring at the dim red lights that blinked in slow, rhythmic succession, like a pulse in the dark. Everything had changed. The syndicate had shown their hand, and the battle that had begun so many years ago, one of survival, loyalty, and duty, had taken on a new shape. It wasn't about who would win the war anymore. It was about what they would become after the war was over. Gabe had spent the past 24 hours sorting through shattered fragments of the truth, trying to piece together a world he thought he understood. Aylin, the alien woman who had first seemed so perfect, so dutiful, she was caught in the same struggle as he was. She, too, had been a pawn, a piece in a game much larger than the both of them. Now they were faced with a choice: fight for the peace that had been promised, or burn everything to the ground to break free of the chains they had worn so long. His fingers hovered over the console, his mind racing. He had been told what to do by his superiors, by the very people who had placed him in this position of power. But Aylin's words kept echoing in his mind, the weight of her choices heavier than any order he'd ever been given. Suddenly, the door behind him slid open, and he didn't have to turn around to know who it was. He could feel her presence in the room, a calm, knowing energy that he had come to both dread and rely on. "Aylin," he said, his voice hoarse. There was a rawness to it now, something born from too many unanswered questions, too much uncertainty. He didn't know what to expect from her anymore. There was no predictability to her, not after everything that had happened. "I couldn't stay away," she said softly, stepping into the room. Her silhouette was framed by the dim light, her eyes searching him as though she were trying to read the thoughts he no longer wanted to hide. "I know you're torn, but I've made my choice." Gabe turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers. There was something different in her, something fiercer yet sadder than before. Her psychic abilities were no longer an enigma. He could feel them now, like a quiet hum in the back of his mind. She wasn't just a tool of war anymore. She was something else entirely, something free. "What choice?" he asked, his throat tight. He couldn't help the bitterness that bled into his words. How could he ever trust anything again after everything that had been done to him? "The choice to be something more," she said. "To break free. To end the cycle, Gabe. You were right about the syndicate. They wanted us both as pawns. They still want us to follow their game. But I refuse. I won't let them use me anymore." He studied her, as if searching for the faintest sign that she was lying. There was none. She was telling the truth, or at least the version of the truth she had come to accept. Her eyes were wide open now, no longer clouded by doubt. He could see the rawness in her, the same emotional wounds he carried, hidden deep beneath the surface. "And what about us?" Gabe asked, his voice softer now. "What about the peace we were supposed to protect? Can we really just walk away from all of it, from everything we've worked for?" Aylin shook her head, her expression unreadable. "We can't protect a peace built on lies, Gabe. We can't live in a world where we're controlled by shadows, by the syndicate or anyone else. If we want to have a future, we have to make it ourselves." Her words struck him like a thunderclap, reverberating through every fiber of his being. It wasn't just a choice between duty and defiance. It was a choice between accepting the world as it was or fighting for something new. But could they really build something new? Could they truly escape the weight of everything they'd been forced into? The answer came to him in a rush, a surge of clarity that cut through the doubt and uncertainty. The syndicate's hold on them was built on manipulation, on fear. But fear could be dismantled. Manipulation could be undone. If they were going to have any hope, any chance of rebuilding a world worth fighting for, it started with this moment. He stepped closer to Aylin, his heart hammering in his chest. She was right. It wasn't just about breaking free of the syndicate's control. It was about fighting for their own agency, their own right to choose their fate. "Then we fight," he said, his voice steady. The decision was final, unyielding. Together. Aylin's lips parted in a small, almost imperceptible smile. For the first time, there was a lightness in her that had been missing before. The weight of the past seemed to lift from her shoulders as though she had finally made peace with herself. "Together," she echoed, her voice quiet but firm. Gabe turned back to the console, his fingers flying across the controls. He could feel the shift in the air, a palpable change that filled the room with anticipation. They had no more time to waste. The battle outside was growing fiercer by the second, but it wasn't just a battle for the base. It was a battle for their future, for the future of every soldier, every alien, every person who had ever been caught in the web of the Syndicate's lies. "This is it," Gabe said, his voice a low murmur. "No more games. We fight to win. We fight for freedom." Aylin nodded, stepping up beside him, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm that was about to break. They were ready now, ready to face whatever came next, together. The lights flickered, and the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, but neither of them flinched. They knew what was coming, and for the first time in a long while, Gabe felt something like hope stir deep within him. It was a hope born of rebellion, of breaking free from the cycle of war and control, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to rebuild what had been shattered. And as the storm outside raged on, they made their final choice. They would no longer be pawns. They would become the masters of their own fate.